And Mr. Patterson, you may ask your next question of this witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. When we spoke, we were looking at Table 2 of Dr. Quinn's report. So if we could bring that back up. And Dr. Thornton, I had asked, what is the significance of the data presented in this table?
So this table provides the distribution by race of the registered voters in North Carolina as of Dr. Quinn's 2015 report, and then the same distribution, but for those who we identified without a match to an ID in 2015. And then the other half of the chart shows the distribution of the registered voters as of his report in 2020 that he analyzed, and then the same distribution but among the no matches based on his 2020 work. The significance of this chart is it shows that both the percentage of, in terms of the distribution of African Americans without an ID as he's identified has been reduced substantially between 2015 and 2020. In addition, they've been reduced in terms of sheer numbers. In 2015, Dr. Quinn estimated that about 140,000 African American registered voters did not have an acceptable form of ID. In 2020, that number has been reduced from 140,000 to a little less than 114,000.
Okay, and I just want to make sure I understand the data on this table. So if we look at the 2015 data, it shows that for Black/African Americans, we're 22.45% on the in the registered voter database, but 36.67% of the no matches that Dr. Quinn found. Is that right?
That is correct.
So that's a gap of a little more than 14 percentage points.
That's correct.
And then for 2020, the same gap is a little less than 3 percentage points. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. You reviewed Dr. Quinn's report at the preliminary injunction stage of this litigation, as we discussed, correct?
That is correct.
And as I believe you said, he had predicted that, in his opinion, the racial gap in ID possession would not change if you were to do the analysis presently. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And to what extent were those conclusions borne out by Dr. Quinn's matching analysis in this case, those predictions that he made in his preliminary injunction report?
They were not, both in terms of the percentage as well as just the sheer numbers. The numbers of African Americans identified potentially without an ID based on his matching was reduced, as well as the percentage.
Now, in his testimony last week, Dr. Quinn speculated that the racial disparity in his 2020 analysis may have turned out wider because he did not have access to the federal ID databases, including passports, veterans' IDs, and military IDs. To what extent do Dr. Quinn's findings support such speculation?
I think it is speculation because keep in mind the only piece of information that he reviewed was based on the American National Election Study that was consisted of 146 North Carolinians who were surveyed. And as he testified, that survey is not to be used at the state level. And he did not address military IDs or veterans IDs. And based on the composition of those two groups, I do not understand why he could make the conclusion that he made.
Okay, and now let's turn to Table 4 of your report. And this is titled, wait till we get there. Okay. It's titled Percentage Who Voted During One-Stop Early Voting Among Dr. Quinn's No Matches Who Voted. And now, could you explain for the court what the significance of the data presented in this table is?
Sure. During one-stop early voting, individuals may obtain at the Board of Elections offices, they may obtain a voter ID free of charge. And so the consequence of that is it's relevant to look at who is utilizing one-stop early voting. And in North Carolina in 2020, 65% of the ballots cast were through one-stop early voting. So the relevance of Table 4 is it looks at the no matches on Dr. Quinn, among Dr. Quinn's 480,000 no matches, and looks at the distribution for each of these elections in terms of who voted, as well as who voted through one-stop early voting.
Okay, and this, oh, go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
That's fine.
Okay, I was just going to ask, and does this show that African American voters use one-stop early voting disproportionately compared to white voters?
Yes, it does. In each of these years, the percentages, and in the chart I've highlighted in yellow, the percentage of African Americans and white voters among the no matches who voted and voted one stop. So, for example, in 2016, about 57% of those who voted who were African American voted with one stop, as compared to a little over 49% among white voters. In 2020, it was 63.3% for among the African American registered voters who voted and voted one stop, as compared to 58% among white voters.
I'd now like to turn to Table 6, which is another table that you present in your report. And this one is titled Comparison of the Distribution of Dr. Quinn's No Matches Overall and Among Those Who Voted in 2020. Did Dr. Quinn in his report present data on who voted in 2020 on his no match list?
No, he did not.
And is that what you're presenting here in this table?
Yes.
And what is the significance of these turnout figures?
So what this chart does is it looks at the racial and ethnic distribution of the 480,000 no matches identified by Dr. Quinn, and then it compares it to who voted in 2020 in the same racial distribution. Keeping in mind that in 2020, North Carolina had one of its highest percentages among the registered voters who voted at 75.4%. So here we have a large portion in comparison to other years who voted. And what this chart shows is that while among the no matches, 23.6% are African American, among those who cast a ballot, it was 19%. So in 2020, African Americans, among those who were on the no match list, were less likely to vote.
Okay, and for white voters, by contrast, there were 52.65 on the no match list, and then 56.56% of those who voted. Is that right?
That's right. It's a higher percentage.
Okay. And if we look down at the no matches and distribution who voted in 2020, you have a total of 199,450. Is that right?
That's correct.
And a total of 480,836. So does that indicate that less than 50% of the voters on the no match list turned out in 2020?
Yes. Keeping in mind that overall, the voter participation, or the percentage who voted in 2020, was 75.4%. And here it's less than 50% among the no matches.
And what are some possible explanations for the low turnout rates among Dr. Quinn's no matches?
It's possible that they no longer live in North Carolina. They're no longer, we know that they're disproportionately inactive voters. So there's a possibility that they're no longer in North Carolina, given it's such a difference in the proportion who voted.
And among those individuals on the no match list who voted, you've indicated that African Americans were disproportionately less likely to vote than their overall distribution on the no match list. What are some possible explanations for the particularly low turnout rate among Dr. Quinn's African American no matches?
Again, I discussed earlier, or testified about mobility. African Americans are, in general, more likely to move within state as well as out of state. That's based on census data. And so consequently, that could impact these proportions. We also know among the no matches, there are some military personnel. So that would also go to mobility. They may have lived in North Carolina for a time, but may with mobility may no longer be in North Carolina.
And I believe you testified earlier that Dr. Quinn did not establish that white registered voters and African American registered voters were equally likely to be eligible voters in North Carolina. Are the results in this table consistent with a finding that African American registered voters are less likely to actually be eligible voters in North Carolina than white registered voters?
Yes, to the extent that this is indicative of no longer living in North Carolina because you're not voting in a year when there was a high turnout rate, and we have a higher proportion of inactive voters among the no matches. It we would say statistically it may very well be correlated with one another.
Okay, and now I'd like to turn to Table 8. And this table is titled Percentage Without a Driver's License Number or Last 4 Digits of the Social Security Number among Dr. Quinn's no matches compared to the snapshot of registered voters. And Dr. Thornton, what is the significance of the data displayed in this table?
Okay, to the extent you're missing information, it means that you're increasing the odds of having a no match. And so if the driver's license isn't populated in the data, or if the social security number is not populated in the data, then that means that one cannot use that matching as a possible matching set of criteria. So by definition, if you lack something to match by, you're going to increase the likelihood of a no match. What this table shows is focusing on, for example, the last 4 digits of the social security number. Among registered voters, 7.3% are lacking Social Security number in the voter registration data. However, among the no matches, it's 23.4%. So that would tell me that I'm missing more information among the no matches, and that shouldn't be surprising because they're on the no match list. But importantly, also, among African Americans on the no match list, 30% are missing Social Security number. So if I didn't have any other information but that, what is the likelihood of being on the no match list? It's going to be higher for African Americans just because of one element alone. They're missing Social Security number at a much higher rate.
And so what implications does this have for the validity of Dr. Quinn's results and the racial disparity that he reported?
Well, to the extent that we're missing information, to the extent it's disproportionately lacking among the African American registered voters, you're going to expect a higher rate. And going back to where we started, we have a gap of 2.14 percentage points. Is the 2.14 percentage points being influenced by the lack of data, the lack of, for example, having Social Security number?
Now, Dr. Quinn performed what he called a sensitivity analysis to try to account for information he could not access. In your opinion, to what extent does Dr. Quinn's sensitivity analysis support his conclusions?
Well, Dr. Quinn's sensitivity analysis is based in part on the very matching that he did. So with the shortcomings of the matching, there's going to be problems with the sensitivity analysis. One, he did not look at the no matches. And number two, he tends to focus on passports. And again, as I testified, based on a survey, when there are other forms of IDs that are not being captured that may have the opposite effect that he is purporting with respect to passports. And those are the veterans' IDs, the military IDs, as well as the local government IDs. We know that, again, based on census data, that the government employees are a higher proportion African American. So again, these are IDs that he's not including and doesn't discuss in his sensitivity analysis.
Now, you've mentioned military IDs a couple times. Is there evidence that military IDs, the inclusion of those in SB 824, could narrow the racial disparity in Dr. Quinn's no match list?
It's possible. We know that veterans and military IDs are approximately similar in terms of the percentage to the population in North Carolina. So consequently, if they're disproportionately would explain the no matches, then it could, again, going back, we have a gap of 2.14 percentage points. A small deviation can influence the outcomes.
And going back to Dr. Quinn's 2015 analysis, when he did have access to military IDs, in your opinion, did his analysis capture the full array of military IDs that would qualify under SB 824 back in 2015?
We really do not know. In part, keep in mind, in 2015, Dr. Quinn reported the additional matches by looking at it additively. He added passports, then he added military IDs, then he added veterans IDs. We do not know what proportion of those with a passport had a military ID or had a veteran's ID. So it's unknown. The other important piece going back to the 2015 matching is the information on military IDs, veteran IDs, and passports was provided as a data set. Essentially, we do not know how, in specific terms, how the matching was actually conducted because we did not have access to the passport data, the military data, the veterans ID data. So it was a black box. Here are the matches. We do not know in great detail, if any, if, for example, the military IDs included military IDs given to civilian personnel or spouses or children. It's just not clear what the black box was.
And is there evidence from his 2015 no match analysis that there were individuals that likely did have a military ID on his no match list?
Yes, in terms of his additive, there were individuals added after he added the passports.
Now, to what extent, I'm sorry, I'll strike that question. What is the impact of Dr. Quinn's failure to manually review his no matches for false negatives, now turning again to his most recent analysis under SB 824?
Okay, well, when I perform matching, I want to look at my no matches to see if I'm missing something. And one can manually look at it and then more systematically look at the data by, for example, identifying frequently occurring addresses, frequently occurring cities, states. If there's a pattern with respect to the individuals who are appearing on the list. So, for example, among this, just by manually looking at the data and then one can frequency, you'll see that there are individuals with Fort Bragg as the city among the 480,000 no matches. One can see that there are individuals at Wake Forest and at WSSU and other schools and universities on the no match list who one could perhaps have a military ID or a student ID that either wasn't part of the matching or we're lacking that information on the IDs.
Now, could Dr. Quinn have done these types of manual reviews of his no match list in a way that was not prohibitively labor intensive?
Sure, I did it. I looked at the data and I frequencied it. I sorted the data and then I frequencied the data to see what was there.
Now, another thing you talk about in your report are shortcomings with the DMV data that Dr. Quinn used for his matching analysis. And there are a few tables in particular that you mentioned, and I was just going to mention each of those and ask you, what potential impact that could have. So the first is there's a driver history table. Could you tell us what the significance of Dr. Quinn not including that in his matching analysis is?
Sure. So in DMV data, what was provided is a driver ID table. So it has one issuance. And so an issuance would have when was it issued and when was it or expired or will be expired. But it's one issuance per customer. There's also a DMV driver history file. And you would think, well, because it's history, you would think, oh, okay, it's historical. So if the issuance that was provided in the driver ID is expired, that those in the history file would also be expired, but that's not the case. There are other issuances for the customer that are in the driver history ID file that are not expired. and those data were not provided. What we know from the work that Brian Neesby did back in 2015, that the driver history ID table would identify additional driver's license IDs that are valid and unexpired beyond what is in the driver ID table.
And you also explained that Dr. Quinn did not use a table for name changes. Can you explain the significance of that?
Sure. So that the name that's in the voter registration file and the name that we have in the DMV file, there's one name. And yet, historically, these names can change, particularly among women, and the women are somewhat higher proportion among the no matches. So by having name changes, the name may have changed in the DMV data, but not in the voter reg file, or vice versa. By having the name changes in the DMV data, one would potentially have more matches.
Okay, and another thing you say that he's missing is status code information. Could you explain the significance of that?
So again, there's a status history, and a customer would have up to 3 statuses. And it's important here because one needs to have what we call a many-to-many match to match all the possibilities of the data, so that one makes sure that one has the proper status for each ID, knowing that we're missing some of the valid IDs because we do not have the driver history file.
Okay, and then the last one that I believe you discussed is about a transfer field. Could you explain the significance of that?
So there's a transfer state code, and it was not produced either. The transfer state code identifies individuals that the DMV is aware of have moved away from or out of state. So they're no longer living in North Carolina. Again, back in 2015, Brian Neesby found at that point in time, among the no matches, which was a smaller number of no matches at that time, he had identified 48,000 of the no matches at that time had actually moved out of state. So given the number of inactive voters we have amongst this group, and knowing historically about what the influence of the transfer state code, having that additional information may identify individuals among the 480,000 no matches who actually no longer live in North Carolina.
Right, and now looking back at this table 8, which is up on the screen, which was again about social security number and driver's license number being populated among Dr. Quinn's no matches in the voter registration file. If I look under overall and then under missing driver's license number, it says 47.99%. Does that mean that over 50% of Dr. Quinn's no matches actually have a driver's license number in the voter registration table?
It means that among the no matches, 47.99 are missing driver's license in the voter registration data file.
So over 50% have a driver's license in the voter registration file.
That's correct.
And could one explanation or a partial explanation for that be this missing information that Dr. Quinn didn't have from the DMV when conducting his matches? Could some of those actually match if we did have that information?
Yes, I did a match, and I found that over 200,000, just based on driver's license alone, match. Now, based on the current data, it would suggest that they may be no longer, they may be expired in part. But we don't know is if we had the other issuance information, or if we had the transfer state code information, if that would explain the 200,000 plus matches that I identified.
And my understanding is that the voter file that Dr. Quinn was working with had over 7.2 million voters in it. Approximately how many of Dr. Quinn's no matches that are African American would have to be matched to bring African Americans into parity on his no match list and in the registered voter database overall?
Overall, about 18,000.
And how about if we just looked at active voters?
It would be less than 7,000.
And Dr. Thornton, given these numbers and all your testimony in this case, in your expert opinion, has Dr. Quinn established that there is a racial disparity in the possession of qualifying ID under SB 824?
Not with the uncertainty of the information and the lack of information that we have regarding the other IDs.
Thank you, Dr. Thornton. Your Honors, I tender the witness.
All right, Ms. Riggs, you may cross-examine this witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Dr. Thornton. For the record, my name is Allison Riggs, and I'll be asking you some questions on behalf of plaintiffs. It's good to see you again today.
Good to see you.
Dr. Thornton, you've testified in a number of voting-related cases in recent years. Isn't that correct?
I would say a few.
You testified in both the federal and state cases challenging House Bill 589, North Carolina's previous voter ID law, yes?
I believe it was the federal case in which I testified.
You offered reports in both cases, though, correct?
That's correct.
And in both cases, you were hired by Republican legislators or then Republican-led North Carolina State Board of Elections. Isn't that true?
I don't know exactly who I was retained by. I was retained by the state as far as I know.
So you testified for the defense in each case, correct?
Yes, I was retained by the defendant.
And in both cases, you offered rebuttals to experts who had documented a racially disparate impact of the voter ID law on voters of color, correct?
Yes, they had a no match rate, yes.
And you critiqued that racially disparate no match list from those two experts, correct?
I did.
And House Bill 589 also had other provisions besides voter ID. Do you recall?
Vaguely.
Okay. Well, if I represent that to you, do you recall offering testimony to rebut other expert testimony that the additional non-voter ID provisions of House Bill 589 at issue in the federal case would also disparately impact Black voters?
I vaguely recall.
Rebutting testimony about the racially disparate impact of other provisions of House Bill 589, correct?
That's correct.
And you mentioned in direct that you were an expert for Virginia Republican defendants in the Lee versus Virginia State Board of Elections voter ID case, correct?
Again, I recall I was retained by the state. I don't know who specifically retained me other than counsel for the defendant.
You were defending the voter ID law, correct?
I don't really think I can say whether I defend anything. I was looking at that time, the analysis of plaintiff's expert.
You were retained by the parties defending the voter ID law, correct?
That's what I believe I just said.
Okay. And there you offered testimony, again, critiquing plaintiff's experts' evidence of racially disparate patterns of ID possession in Virginia, correct?
I vaguely recall.
You also offered expert testimony in Fair Fight versus Raffensperger recently, didn't you?
I believe so, yes.
And you were retained by Georgia Republican state defendants, weren't you?
I was retained by the Secretary of State, as I recall, but again, I don't keep track of which party is the defendant.
You don't know that Mr. Raffensperger is in fact the Georgia Secretary of State?
At that time, yes.
And
But
that he is a Republican?
I do not keep track of everyone's political party. I'm sorry.
And you critiqued plaintiff's expert, Dr. Michael Herron's testimony that precinct closures in Georgia would have a disproportionate impact on Black voters, didn't you?
I critiqued his testimony.
And his testimony was that precinct closures would have a disproportionate impact on Black voters, wasn't it?
In part, he gave a number of different statistics that varied.
Do you recall that one of those was that precinct closures in the state of Georgia would disproportionately impact Black voters?
He may very well have. I don't recall the details.
Do you recall critiquing his expert analysis on that front?
I recall critiquing his analysis, but I do not recall the details.
All right. If we could pull up, this has not been admitted. It's, sorry, before you display it, Your Honors, I'd like to display to the court Plaintiff's Exhibit 111, which is Thornton's rebuttal report in the Raffensperger case. May I have permission to publish to the witness?
Is there any objection to that from any side?
At this time, I mean, I haven't seen it. I assume the witness will be able to identify whether or not it is actually her report.
All right, you may proceed. You may proceed, Mr. Riggs, at this time.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ashley, can you put up PX 111? Dr. Thornton, do you recognize this exhibit as a rebuttal report that you submitted in Fair Fight versus Raffensperger? We can scroll through it if it would help.
At least the first few pages looks like something I would have written.
And then can we scroll down to the summary of her findings? I think it's at 5. Dr. Thornton, does this refresh your recollection about what you critiqued Dr. Herron's testimony on?
Yes, I'd have to read it to really refresh my memory. I apologize.
No, that's fine. If Ashley, if you'll scroll down to the bullet points, that may help.
Okay, I've read those bullet points.
And you critiqued plaintiff's expert, Dr. Michael Herron's testimony on the precinct closures and their effect on Black voters. Isn't that correct?
I looked at the precinct closures that he looked at. Beyond that, here, I'm not seeing anything in these bullets on race. I very well may have. I just don't remember the details.
You can pull that down, Ashley. You've also testified on behalf of, Dr. Thornton, you've also testified or offered expert report in a case called Feldman versus Arizona Secretary of State's office, correct?
I recall I testified.
Okay. And you testified on behalf of Republicans defending in that case, correct?
I believe I was retained by the state.
Were you were retained by Republican state officials, isn't that correct?
I don't know.
And in that case, you offered a rebuttal report critiquing plaintiffs' experts' documentation of the racially disparate effects of changes to voter registration deadlines. Isn't that correct?
I do not remember.
Can we pull up PX 107, Your Honors? Before we publish, I'll represent to you that I'll ask the witness to authenticate it. May I have permission to publish?
Well, yes, and I'll allow you to publish anything that you'd like to, with the caveat that should one of the other lawyers cross-examining this witness object to it, they can voice their objection at that time. So you can proceed just as we have throughout the duration of this trial, and that is, you don't need to ask my permission to publish something to a witness. You can do so at your will, subject to a lawyer objecting. I'll hear from that lawyer at that time.
All right, thank you, Your Honor.
Does that sound okay?
Yes, thank you, Your Honor.
Okay.
Dr. Thornton, is this the rebuttal report you submitted in Feldman versus Arizona Secretary of State's office et al.? And Ashley, if you just keep scrolling.
Based on the first few pages, yes.
Okay, and then can we go down to the summary at page 4? And here you were asked, I assume, counsel for defendants in this case. Is that accurate?
That's what it states.
And that you were asked to review Dr. Rodden's analysis that the change of laws would disproportionately affect voters of color. I think that was actually, Ashley, if you could scroll up to the top of that page, I think that's where it said that, right there. Or at the bottom of the page 4 going into page 5.
Says that I'm looking at changes in voting precincts, usage of different types of precincts, and use of provisional ballots.
That's right. And does this refresh your recollection that you were rebutting expert analysis that those changes would adversely impact African American, Hispanic, and Native American voters?
That's what it states. In terms of what I did, I don't remember. I
Okay.
apologize.
This would have been a sworn rebuttal, a sworn report, correct?
I believe so.
Okay. And then if you'll just scroll down. Ashley, thank you. And here in your summary, page 4, I think going into page 5, you critique Dr. Rodden's analyses that would support his claims that these law changes would disproportionately affect voters of color. Is that right?
It appears as though I am critiquing either his calculations.
Actually, can you scroll up a little bit too, if it wouldn't disturb? Right there.
It looks like I'm looking at a large portion of this looks to be looking at provisional ballots.
And do you see the bullet point where you conclude that the explanatory power of his models of out-of-precinct ballots is weak and his usage of estimated race and ethnicity data produce unreliable estimates?
Yes, I vaguely recall that he had a very low adjusted R-square, and I recall that there was an issue in how he calculated his estimates. In other words, the way in which I'd have to read the report.
Okay.
So
Actually,
my recollection is it's a technical issue. I just don't remember the details.
okay. Actually, you can take that down. Thank you. Dr. Thornton, you've also testified on behalf of Republicans in North Carolina in redistricting cases. Isn't that true?
If you're asking me if I've been retained by the state in redistricting cases, yes.
You offered a report in Common Cause v. Lewis and Harper v. Lewis in 2019, which were challenges to North Carolina's congressional and legislative maps as partisan gerrymanders. Isn't that right?
I recall writing, critiquing, and reviewing the algorithms of plaintiffs' experts. That's what I recall.
Okay. And in both cases, you were hired by Republican defendants defending an alleged Republican gerrymander. Isn't that correct?
I was retained by the state. That's all I recall.
Okay. You also testified in a Ohio redistricting case as well. Is that right?
Yes.
In Ohio, A. Philip Randolph Institute versus Ryan Smith, Speaker of the House of Ohio, you were hired by Republican state defendants to provide expert testimony in support of their defense of an alleged Republican partisan gerrymander. Isn't that correct?
Again, I'm retained by the defendant. I don't keep track of parties.
Okay. Dr. Thornton, in your voting expert work, you consistently testify on behalf of Republican governmental entities defending voting laws alleged to be discriminatory, don't you?
I don't know. I don't know who's contacting me. I don't know who calls me other than counsel for example, the defendant.
And you understand that who you've been retained for in this case is in fact the Republican state legislators here in North Carolina, correct?
I just know I've been retained by the defendant.
Dr. Thornton, in your expert voting work, where racially disparate impact is an issue, you consistently offer critiques and testimony that those racial disparities don't exist or are smaller than plaintiffs allege, correct?
I don't know what all my testimony has been.
I'd like to ask you a few questions now regarding your areas of expertise. You don't purport to be an expert in the field of political science, do you?
No.
You haven't published any articles in peer-reviewed political science journals, have you?
That's correct.
All right. Dr. Thornton, one of your critiques in your report and in your direct examination of Professor Quinn's analysis has to do with his use of ratios. Is that right?
Yes.
Dr. Quinn computes the ratio of the percentage of African American voters relative to the percentage of white voters on the no match list by dividing those percentages, correct?
That's correct.
With the percentage of African American registered voters on the no match list in the numerator?
Yes.
And I think we've discussed it, but per Dr. Professor Quinn's analysis, that number is 7.61%.
I believe that's correct.
And then with the percentage of white registered voters on the no match list in the denominator, right?
That's correct.
And per Professor Quinn's analysis, that percentage is 5.4%, right?
So I believe it's 5.47%.
I'm sorry. If I misspoke, I meant to say 5.47. That's the right number, right?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. You agree that ratios serve as a descriptive statistic used in all fields which calculate the relative occurrence of an event, don't you?
They're used, yes.
And you agree they're used as a descriptive statistic, correct?
Yes, it is a descriptive statistic.
You're familiar with the concept of a risk ratio, aren't you, Dr. Thornton?
Yes.
And that's a ratio that compares the risk of an event among one group with the risk among another group, correct?
That's a way of describing it.
And a risk ratio would compare two groups differentiated by demographic factors, such as gender, male or female. Is that right?
Well, it could be beyond gender. It's measuring the ratio of two numbers, two percentages.
Right, different, but that was an example, but differentiated by a demographic factor would be one way to go about looking at a risk ratio, correct?
Well, it doesn't have to be a demographic factor. Maybe I wasn't clear, but it doesn't have to be a demographic group comparison. It can be customer based, or it can be many different ways of comparing different groups.
I understand. A risk ratio could compare two groups differentiated by demographic factors such as race, correct?
It could.
And a relative risk ratio is calculated by dividing the risk in the first group by the risk in the second group. Isn't that right?
As you've defined it, yes.
The ratio reported by Dr. Quinn in his report is a relative risk ratio then, isn't that right?
It's a ratio of those two percentages, yes.
Let me make sure I understand your answer. The ratio reported by Dr. Quinn is a relative risk ratio, isn't that right?
As you've described it, yes.
Okay. It divides the rate of an occurrence of an event, the lack of qualifying ID, between one group with another, correct?
That's how he calculated it, yes.
The risk ratio of 1 would indicate identical risk among two groups, isn't that true?
Yes.
And that would be what we would see in this case if the rate of registered voters without a qualifying ID was the same between African American voters and white voters. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, if those two percentages are the same, you'll have a ratio of 1.
A risk ratio greater than 1 indicates increased risk for the group in the numerator, right?
As you've described it, yes.
And as you agreed earlier, here, the group in the risk ratio numerator is the percentage of African American voters lacking acceptable ID, correct?
Yes, that's what Dr. Quinn did. Yes.
And you agree that Dr. Quinn's ratio, based on his analysis, indicates an increased risk that African American registered voters lack qualifying ID at a higher rate than white voters. Isn't that correct?
Based on his calculations, that's what he concludes.
Okay. I'd like to pull up LX 183, which was used during your direct examination. Can you see this exhibit?
Sort of, yes. I'm sorry, I have terrible eyesight, but I will do my best.
Okay, well, if you need us to zoom in on part of it, please let me know. We'd be happy to do so. This exhibit is titled Qualifying ID Possession Rate, correct?
Yes.
And here you calculate ID possession rather than the percentage of African American and white voters that lack qualifying ID. Isn't that right?
That's what this demonstrative does.
But
Yes.
okay, and you do report in this demonstrative Dr. Quinn's no match percentages here, 7.61% for African American voters and 5.47% for white voters, right?
Yes.
And you agree, strike that. And you agree that if you calculated the rate that African American voters are on the no match list compared to white voters by dividing those percentages, the result would be 1.39, correct?
Yes.
And if you do the same for 2016 and 2018 voters on this slide, dividing the no match rate of African American voters by white voters, the result is over 2, correct?
Yes, I believe it's at 2, but the percentage difference has gone down from the 2.14 percentage points. So the percentage point difference has gone down to closer to 1%. But he has your risk assessment number is greater than 2 or 2.
Right. So looking at 2016 voters, then 3.14 divided by 1.54 is over 2, correct?
Yeah, slightly over 2, yes.
So the risk ratio, the risk of Black voters being who voted in that election, the risk of them not having an ID compared to white voters is over 2 times per a risk ratio analysis. Isn't that correct?
Again, that's what the arithmetic is, but it's important to recognize that the no match percentage has actually gone down amongst that group to 3.14% for African Americans and whites to 1.5%. So it's about half. That's how you get the 2.
Right, but the question was about the risk ratio, right? The risk ratio is more than 2.
Yes, based on those 2 percentage which is what I was trying to describe.
Okay, and the same thing is true. 2.33 is more than twice 1.14 for the percentage of 2018 voters on the no match list, African American compared to white.
That's what the arithmetic would show.
And so the risk ratio for Black voters in that election being on the no match list would be over 2.
It would be over 2, but it's important to recognize what those underlying percentages are to calculate the 2.
That's fine. I was just asking you about the risk ratio. All right, now I'd like to turn to LX 254 at page 2. All right, now looking at the title of this slide on page 2, the 96.86% and the 98.46% figures you report are the possession rates that you reported in the previous demonstrative exhibit, not the rate at which voters lack ID. Isn't that true?
Right, if you subtract the 98.86 from 1 and the 98.46 from 1, you have the no match percentages.
The 3.14 and the 1.4 numbers we just discussed.
1.54.
Thank you for that correction. So this slide reads specifically, in the 2016 election, registered Black voters at 96.86% were 1.6% more likely to lack qualifying ID than registered white voters at 98.46%. Do you see that?
Yes.
It would be more accurate to compare these possession rates by saying the difference is 1.6 percentage points, correct?
You could say difference.
That is in fact the difference between 96.86 and 98.46, isn't that right?
I believe it is.
And so that it would be more accurate to compare these possession rates by saying the difference is 1.6 percentage points, correct?
One could say that, yes.
It is not accurate to say that Black voters are 1.6% more likely to lack qualifying ID, correct?
Perhaps if one said 1.6 percentage points more likely, that may be the clarifying thing to add to that slide.
So as written, that title is misleading, correct?
Well, it's not precise.
It is not accurate, correct?
I would just say it doesn't have precision in terms of the title, but in terms of the graphic depiction, it is accurate.
To measure likelihood, you would need to divide these strike that. To measure likelihood, you would need to divide these possession rate percentages as you did in LX 183, correct?
If one wanted to calculate the ratio, I think we talked about that. One would divide the 3.14 and the 1.54.
Right, because this is a possession rate, not the rate at which Black voters lack ID, correct?
It's possession rate. It's actually both, because graphically it's both possession and the lack of possession.
The percentage, 96.86%, is the percentage possession, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and so because this is a possession rate, it is not the rate at which Black voters lack ID, correct?
Well, it's either take these possession rates or subtract them to get the percentage that do not under Dr. Quinn's matching.
And you haven't done that for the entitling this demonstrative you've created, have you?
No, it's one or the other. You can do it possession or you can flip it and subtract it from one.
Okay, so just to be clear, this title does not accurately represent the rate at which voters lack qualifying ID then, does it?
If you're asking me, does it divide one by the other to come up with two? No, it does not.
And it is talking about possession rates, not lacking qualifying ID rates, correct?
It's focusing on the possession rates. And again, you subtract one from the possession rates and then you have the percentage that lack. So, put in one or put in the other. It can go either way.
I understand your answer, Dr. Thornton, but the title is lack qualifying ID, not have ID, correct?
Yes.
So showing possession in the title and lack of ID in the graphic is misleading, isn't it?
I don't know. I'll leave it up to the reader to decide if it's misleading, but both pieces of information can be gleaned from it.
And in fact, when you look at the no match rates you included in LX 183, it is true that in the 2016 election, Black voters do in fact have a no match rate that is more than 2 times that of white voters, correct?
Based on dividing 3.14 by 1.54 percentage points.
Thank you, Dr. Thornton. Ashley, we can take down this demonstrative. I want to talk to you about one of the summary criticisms of Professor Quinn's analysis that you discussed in your report and a little bit indirect with Mr. Patterson. You said, and you can refer to your report, it's JX 800. If you have a clean copy, please feel free to refer to it in hard copy if that's easier for you. You said on page 7, paragraph 19, that Dr. Quinn assumes the proportion of no matches for African American and white registered voters should be the same. Is that right?
I apologize. Which paragraph is that?
Paragraph 19, it's on page 7 of JX 800.
Sorry.
You're fine. Let me know when you've had a chance to look at it.
I see that.
All right. And so now do you see that you critiqued Professor Quinn for assuming the proportion of no matches for African American and white registered voters should be the same?
Yes.
You said he doesn't take into account factors that may be correlated with race, which may influence why an individual is on the no match list, correct?
Yes.
And I believe you discussed with Mr. Patterson that some factors, certain factors are correlated with race and impact whether one is on the no match list. Can be ones like geographic mobility. Do you
Yes.
recall that?
Yes.
Okay. And I believe you mentioned that geographic mobility includes moving within state, not just moving out of state. Isn't that right?
That's correct.
And if a black voter moves within the state, that black voter is still eligible to vote in the state of North Carolina, isn't that voter?
Yes.
Other factors that may be correlated with race that impact whether a voter is on a no match list, correct?
Yes.
You didn't offer a comprehensive list of such factors in your report, did you?
No. I identified those that I could measure.
You did not perform an analysis in your report to determine whether factors correlated with race impact whether a voter is on the no match list, did you?
Actually, I did look at factors such as lacking social security number in the data, which was correlated with race based on the statistics that I gave previously.
Well, that's one factor. We've established, correct, that you haven't listed all of the factors, right?
Agreed.
And so you haven't done an analysis in your report to determine whether those factors correlated with race, which you have not exhaustively listed, impact whether a voter is on the no match list, correct?
Yes. And as I said, testified, I examined those that I could quantify.
On the geographic mobility and moving out of state, you cannot quantify what impact, if any, that factor might have on Professor Quinn's observed racial disparity in ID possession, can you?
Well, I do not have the data. What we do know is that African Americans do move from states at a higher rate. What we also know from the prior matching that was done in 2015, that there's a proportion that have moved out of state based on DMV data. Do I have necessary data to quantify it? No, but the data suggests that it would have an impact.
And the data, in fact, talks about geographic mobility in state and out of state, correct?
It distinguishes African Americans move both within state at a higher rate and move out of state at a higher rate.
But you didn't have the necessary data to examine with any specificity the impact that might have had on Dr. Quinn's analysis, is that right?
As I testified already, I do not know among the 480,000 who've moved out of state. What we do know is that the 480,000 tend to be at a higher rate in active voters, and among African Americans, it's an even higher percent.
Your Honor, this is maybe a convenient stopping point in my outline if you'd like to take lunch.
That works very well, thank you. It is now 12:30 and time for our lunch recess. Is there any matter that we need to take up prior to recessing lunch?
Not for the legislative defendants, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Cox, do you have anything?
No, Your Honor.
Okay, then we'll be in recess until 2 p.m. 2 p.m. Thank you.